Imagine designing a tax system that is mathematically just flawlessly efficient. Like, it minimizes economic waste, it perfectly funds government infrastructure, and the underlying equations are so elegant they, eventually contribute to a Nobel Prize.
Right.
But there's just one problem. Implementing this perfectly mathematical system requires you to aggressively tax the basic food supplies of the poorest citizens, while simultaneously giving billionaires a near total tax pass on, like, luxury yachts and private jets.
I mean, it sounds like a complete dystopian policy nightmare, right? But mathematically, and this is the crazy part, mathematically, under the strictest frameworks of welfare economics, that represents pure efficiency.
Wow.
It is the absolute minimization of deadweight loss.
And that brutal paradox is exactly what we're navigating today. So welcome to this special exam prep deep dive. If you're listening to this, you are the learner. Specifically, you're preparing for the Indian Economics Service General Economics Revision. That's GE-03, paper 3.
Right, the DSE and JNU Masters level stuff. It's intense.
Yeah, it is. You are staring down one of the most rigorous, conceptually demanding papers out there. And our mission today is to arm you with the conceptual architecture you need to just absolutely conquer it.
Yeah, and we're grounding this discussion immediately in the reality of the most recent exams because, well, the examiners have been loudly broadcasting their priorities. Like, the 2025 paper featured this massive high-weightage question demanding the derivation of the excess burden of a specific tax, both graphically and algebraically.
Right, the Harburger Triangle stuff.
Exactly. And then in 2024... the exam was heavily anchored around the Samuelson condition for the optimal provision of public goods.
So the through line here is pretty undeniable. The examiners want to see that you, the learner, understand the mechanics of market failure, right? The mathematical justification for government intervention, and then the inevitable economic distortion that happens the exact moment the state begins extracting revenue.
Yeah, they don't want you to just memorize and recite formulas.
No.
They want you to narrate the calculus.
Right. So we're going to build that narrative logically today. We'll start at the genesis of the state's economic role, which is the intrinsic failure of decentralized markets to provide certain types of goods.
And from there, we have to analyze the theoretical attempts to price those goods voluntarily, the total collapse of those attempts, and the subsequent necessity of coercive taxation.
Right, because once we cross into mandatory taxation, we really have to unpack who actually suffers the welfare loss, like the whole complex architecture of tax incidents.
Exactly.
Before finally culminating in the optimal tax theory that balances that crazy efficiency against equity we talked about at the start. So if I'm thinking about where this all begins, the baseline assumption in classical economics is that the free market is a highly efficient allocation mechanism, right?
Yeah, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics.
Right. It tells us that competitive markets exhaust all mutually beneficial trades, which lands us squarely on the Pareto frontier.
The price mechanism is basically this brilliant, decentralized information system. It signals scarcity, it directs resources efficiently. But, and this is a massive fill, but that theorem rests on very strict assumptions.
Right.
And when those assumptions are violated, the whole elegant system just fractures.
Right.
And the most catastrophic fracture happens when we introduce a specific category of goods defined by two immutable properties.
Right. Non-excludability and non-rivalry in consumption, pure public goods.
Yes.
Let's strip away the textbook cliches here. We really don't need to talk about lighthouses again. Let's look at a municipal fireworks display or like a terrestrial FM radio broadcast. Non-excludability just means there is no physical or legal mechanism to prevent someone from consuming the good once it's out there.
Right.
Like, you cannot scramble the fireworks display for people in the park who didn't buy a ticket.
No, the technological cost of exclusion is effectively infinite. And the second property, non-rivalry, that means the marginal cost of an additional consumer is exactly zero.
Okay,
So my listening to the FM radio broadcast does not degrade the audio quality of your radio signal at all. We're both consuming the exact same unit of the goods simultaneously without diminishing the aggregate supply.
Right, okay. But contrast this with an impure public good where one of those conditions starts to decay. I always think of a free Wi-Fi network at a local coffee shop.
That's a great example.
Right, because it's non-excludable. There's no password. Literally anyone can join. And if there's, say, 3 people just browsing text articles, it feels totally non-rivalrous.
Yeah.
But the moment 50 people connect and try to stream 4K video simultaneously, massive congestion sets in.
Yeah, because the bandwidth is finite. At that point of congestion, my consumption directly impedes your consumption.
Right.
So the marginal cost of an additional user is no longer zero. It's positive, and it's rising. The good has become rivalrous, which moves it from a pure public good straight into the territory of common resources, or, impure public goods.
Got it. And for the exam, the examiners really want you to connect these properties directly to the market failure. Like, if a good is non-excludable, it triggers the free rider problem.
Exactly.
We can frame this mathematically as an n-person prisoner's dilemma, right? If every rational actor in the economy knows they cannot be excluded from enjoying the fireworks display, their dominant strategy is to just withhold their contribution.
Right. Why pay if you get it for free?
Exactly. They maximize their individual utility by letting someone else bear the cost.
And because every single agent reaches that exact same rational conclusion, the Nash equilibrium is zero voluntary contribution.
Wow, zero.
The market produces zero fireworks, zero national defense, zero terrestrial radio, assuming there's no advertising model. The price mechanism just completely collapses because it fundamentally relies on the credible threat of exclusion to force consumers to reveal their true willingness to pay.
Right, okay. So the decentralized market completely fails to provide the pure public good. The state has to step in as a centralized provider. But this immediately creates an enormous calculation problem for the government, doesn't it?
It really does.
Like, how does the state know the socially optimal quantity of this pure public good to actually produce?
And that brings us right to Paul Samuelson's seminal 1954 paper, The Pure Theory of Public Expenditure, and, the 2024 exam focus.
Right, right.
Samuelson formalized the general equilibrium conditions for an economy with both private and public goods. To understand the Samuelson condition, we have to look at how we aggregate demand, specifically the constraints of Pareto efficiency in this dual good economy.
Okay, so if I'm picturing this graphically for a private good, like say an apple, we hold the price constant on the y-axis and we sum the individual quantities horizontally along the x-axis to construct the aggregate market demand curve.
Right.
Because we're summing discrete rivalrous units.
Exactly. But for the pure public good, the quantity on the x-axis is fixed across all consumers.
Because of the non-rivalry?
Because of non-rivalry, exactly. We are all consuming the exact same quantity. Therefore, mathematically, we have to hold the quantity constant and sum the individual marginal willingness to pay vertically up the y-axis.
Oh, okay. So we're literally stacking the marginal utility curves on top of each other.
You're stacking them, yes. And this is the spoken English translation of the calculus you need for the exam. Listen closely. Samuelson's condition states that for the optimal provision of a pure public good, the vertical summation of everyone's individual marginal rates of substitution between the public and private good must exactly equal the economy's marginal rate of transformation.
Which is?
Which is the marginal cost of producing that public good.
Okay, so in absolute simplest terms, it's just social marginal benefit must equal marginal cost.
Yes, but for the graduate level derivation, you have to write out the sum of MRS equals MRT. The logic is ironclad. For a private good, Pareto efficiency requires that each individual's MRS equals the MRT. But for a public good, providing one more unit benefits everyone simultaneously. Therefore, the aggregate societal willingness to sacrifice private goods for one more unit of the public good must equal the physical cost of producing it.
I mean, the condition is theoretically beautiful. It perfectly defines the Pareto optimal allocation. But Samuelson himself acknowledged a pretty fatal flaw in actually achieving this state in the real world, right?
Right, yeah.
It requires the central planner to possess perfect information about every single citizen's utility function. How do you find out everyone's true marginal rate of substitution?
Well, you ask them.
Right.
Which leads us to the theoretical framework of Lindell pricing, proposed by Eric Lindell back in 1919. Lindell attempted to construct this sort of pseudo-market mechanism for public goods. Under his model, the government doesn't just levy a flat tax, it charges personalized prices.
Wait, personalized prices? So every individual faces a specific personalized tax rate that exactly matches their own marginal benefit from the public good. Okay, so if I derive massive utility from, like, a new municipal park, I am assigned a high Lindell tax share. But if you barely use it, you face a very low tax share. We both consume the same park, but we pay different prices based on our individualized demand curves.
You've got it. The Lindell equilibrium is fascinating because it is a Pareto-efficient outcome
Yeah.
that voluntarily satisfies the Samuelson condition.
Really?
Yeah. If everyone faces a tax price exactly equal to their marginal benefit, they will all independently vote for the exact same optimal quantity of the public good. The sum of their individualized tax shares perfectly covers the marginal cost of provision.
I mean, that sounds like the holy grail of public finance. We solved the public goods problem without arbitrary coercive taxation.
Right.
But this is where we hit the mechanism design failure, right? Specifically, the preference revelation problem. Because Lindell pricing operates on the totally naive assumption that individuals will honestly report their utility functions to the government.
Exactly. When an individual realizes that their personalized tax bill is a direct positive function of their stated preference, they face a massive financial incentive to systematically understate their true valuation.
Yeah.
It's just the free rider problem manifesting in a new form.
Right. I look at the government survey and say, a new public park. I despise nature. My marginal utility is zero.
Right.
Because I know the park will likely get built anyway because of everyone else's contributions. And since it's not excludable, I still get to walk my dog there every day while paying a Lindell tax rate of 0.
Exactly. Because the mechanism itself incentivizes deception, the government cannot accurately aggregate the marginal rates of substitution. And without true information, Lindell pricing completely fails to achieve the Samuelson condition.
Right.
Economists like Theodore Groves and Edward Clark later attempted to solve this with complex mechanism design. You might see Groves-Clark taxes mentioned, which charge people based on their pivotal impact on the collective decision. But honestly, these are mathematically cumbersome and practically impossible to implement on a macroscopic scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, before we move away from the rationale for government provision, we really have to address a distinct category of goods that frequently trip up students on these exams.
Oh, merit goods and demerit goods.
Yes, it is a critical error to conflate merit goods with public goods.
An absolutely vital distinction. A merit good like primary education or preventative health care is structurally a private good.
Okay.
It is highly excludable. A university can easily deny you entry if you don't pay tuition, and it is rivalrous. A hospital bed occupied by one patient cannot be occupied by another.
So if they are private goods, why does the government intervene so heavily in their provisions?
Well, the justification here stems from a mixture of massive positive externalities and, frankly, a degree of state paternalism. Society as a whole reaps enormous secondary benefits from a highly educated, vaccinated populace.
Right. Lower crime rates, higher aggregate productivity, stronger civic institutions.
Exactly. But the decentralized market undersupplies merit goods because a private individual, when calculating their personal marginal benefit against the tuition cost, they ignore the positive external benefit their education confers on the rest of society. So the government subsidizes or provides the good directly to force consumption up to the socially optimal level.
Right.
And conversely, demerit goods like tobacco possess negative externalities, and the state intervenes through taxation or regulation to suppress consumption below the free market equilibrium.
Okay, which brings us to the inevitable pivot in our structural narrative. If voluntary mechanisms like Lindell pricing are totally doomed by the preference revelation problem, the state is forced to abandon voluntary contributions entirely.
Yeah, they have to.
It must invoke its monopoly on coercion. It must extract revenue mandatorily. But the moment you introduce coercive taxation, you face the immense challenge of designing a system that doesn't trigger, economic collapse or societal revolt.
Right. We must establish the architecture of taxation. And that requires returning to the foundational principles laid out by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. Smith proposed 4 canons of taxation that really remain the benchmark for evaluating any fiscal policy today.
Right. That's equity, certainty, convenience, and economy.
Exactly.
So certainty dictates that the tax liability must be perfectly clear, predictable, and not subject to the arbitrary whim of the tax collector.
Right.
Convenience requires the tax to be levied at a time and in a manner most easily accommodated by the taxpayer, like withholding taxes automatically deducted from a biweekly paycheck.
Yeah.
And economy, which modern economists term administrative efficiency, insists that the deadweight cost of merely operating the tax collection apparatus should be minimized.
But that first canon, equity, that is where the deepest theoretical battle lines are drawn in welfare economics. How do we mathematically define a fair distribution of the tax burden?
Yeah.
The literature generally divides into two opposing paradigms.
Yeah.
The benefit principle and the ability to pay principle.
Okay, let's dismantle the benefit principle first, because it attempts to retain a quasi-market logic, right? Arguing that an individual's tax liability should be strictly proportional to the benefits they receive from government expenditures.
Yes.
Like the classic real-world application is a fuel tax used exclusively to fund highway maintenance. You drive more, you damage the roads more, you buy more fuel, you pay more tax. It possesses a really intuitive fairness, but as a macroeconomic foundation for an entire tax system, it collapses under two fatal flaws. First, as we just established with pure public goods, it is impossible to accurately measure the individualized benefit derived from national defense or the justice system. The preference revelation problem destroys the required data. Right, you can't measure it. And the second flaw is distributive, isn't it? If we strictly enforce the benefit principle, we run into a severe regressivity problem regarding social welfare programs.
Massively.
Like, a household in deep poverty relying on state-subsidized food and housing receives vastly more direct, measurable benefits from the government than a self-sufficient billionaire. Under a strict benefit regime, the poorest citizens would face the highest tax liabilities.
Which violently violates our foundational concepts of distributive justice.
Yeah.
Consequently, modern tax architecture is overwhelmingly anchored in the ability to pay principle. This principle divorces the tax liability entirely from government expenditure. It asserts that individuals should contribute to the state proportional to their economic capacity, usually measured via income, wealth, or consumption.
And the theoretical justification for this isn't just arbitrary political populism. It's grounded deeply in the welfare economics concept of the diminishing marginal utility of income.
Exactly.
As a household's absolute income rises, the utility derived from each additional marginal dollar declines.
Right. If you earn $20,000 a year, the marginal utility of your final $1,000 is astronomical. That money represents basic caloric intake and shelter.
Right.
If the state confiscates it, the utility sacrifice is devastating. But if your income is $20 million, the marginal utility of the last $1,000 is effectively zero. It just represents a fractional adjustment to a diverse investment portfolio.
Which brings us to the core concepts of horizontal and vertical equity. Horizontal equity demands that equals be treated equally. Two households with identical economic capacities and identical life circumstances must face the identical tax burden.
Right.
Which seems simple, but it becomes incredibly complex when factoring in dependence, medical expenses, or regional costs of living.
It gets messy fast. And vertical equity, conversely, dictates the unequal treatment of unequals. Because of the diminishing marginal utility of income, to achieve what John Stuart Mill termed equal sacrifice across society, the tax code must be progressive. Taking 10% of a low-income household's wealth inflicts far more absolute utility damage than taking 10% of a high-income household's wealth.
And it's important to note the graduate-level distinction here between equal absolute sacrifice, equal proportional sacrifice, and equal marginal sacrifice. If the goal is to minimize the total aggregate sacrifice of the entire society, which is the utilitarian ideal equal marginal sacrifice, necessitates a highly progressive marginal tax rate structure. You basically skim the wealth off the top where its utility value is lowest.
Right. But having a progressive statutory tax code means absolutely nothing if we don't understand who is actually bearing the economic pain of the tax.
Yep.
The government can draft a law stating that a specific corporation must pay $1 million in taxes.
Right.
But legislation cannot suspend the laws of supply and demand.
Wait, okay. So this introduces one of the most critical conceptual frameworks in public finance, the theory of tax incidence. We rely heavily on the distinction championed by economist Ursula Hicks. We must sever the concept of formal incidence from effective incidence.
Yes. Formal incidence, or statutory incidence, merely identifies the legal entity required to remit the funds to the Treasury. It's just an administrative designation. Effective incidence, or economic incidence, identifies the entity whose real purchasing power and welfare actually declines as a final result of the tax.
So just to push back practically here, if the government levies a heavy statutory tax on a massive corporation, doesn't the corporation pay it?
No. In a competitive market, statutory incidence is a completely irrelevant illusion.
Really?
Yes. If the government levies a $50 statutory excise tax on the producers of life-saving insulin, the producers do not quietly absorb the loss. They attempt to shift the burden forward to the consumer by raising the equilibrium price.
Okay, and the extent to which they can successfully shift that burden is entirely determined by the relative price elasticities of supply and demand.
Exactly. The mathematical rule for the exam is absolute. The economic burden of a tax falls most heavily on the side of the market that is least responsive to price changes.
Right.
The burden falls on the inelastic side.
Because inelasticity means you are trapped.
Yes.
If demand is perfectly inelastic, like a type 1 diabetic needing insulin, the consumer cannot substitute away from the good when the price rises. The producer, possessing greater elasticity and capital allocation, simply passes the entire $50 tax forward. So the statutory incidence was on the corporation, but the effective incidence falls 100% on the chronically ill consumer.
Precisely. And we can observe the exact inverse of this in a famous real-world policy failure, the 1990 United States luxury tax.
Oh, this is a classic.
The government levied a 10% surcharge on the purchase of luxury yachts, with the statutory incidence placed squarely on the wealthy buyers. The political rhetoric was purely focused on vertical equity. Let's tax the rich.
But they totally ignored the elasticity of demand. The demand for luxury yachts is hyperelastic. Billionaires are not trapped. When the price of yachts jumped by 10%, they immediately substituted away. They started buying luxury real estate, private jets, or vacationing in Europe instead. The quantity of yachts demanded just plummeted.
Right. So who bore the effective incidence? The yacht manufacturers.
Wow.
Their supply was relatively inelastic in the short run. They had specialized factories, specialized shipwrights, immobile capital. They couldn't seamlessly pivot to manufacturing airplanes.
Right.
So to survive the collapse in demand, the producers had to drastically slash the pre-tax price of the yachts. They absorbed the economic blow, which ultimately resulted in mass layoffs of blue-collar shipyard workers.
So the attempt to tax the highly elastic rich resulted in the effective incidence falling violently backward onto relatively inelastic labor.
Exactly. And if you look at the specific incidence formula derived from the Hicksian framework, the fraction of the tax borne by the consumer is determined by the elasticity of supply divided by the sum of the elasticities of supply and demand. So elasticity of S over elasticity of S plus elasticity of D. Yeah. As demand elasticity, the denominator approaches infinity, the consumer's burden approaches zero.
Okay, which perfectly transitions us to the core of the 2025 IES question, the excess burden of taxation. Because regardless of whether the producer or the consumer bears the effective incidence, the very act of taxation destroys economic value. Taxes drive a wedge between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives.
Yes. When that wedge is introduced, the quantity traded in the market shrinks. The trades that would have occurred between the old equilibrium quantity and the new post-tax quantity, they simply vanish.
Right.
These were mutually beneficial trades where the consumer's willingness to pay exceeded the producer's marginal cost.
And the erasure of those mutually beneficial trades creates a pure economic loss that generates zero revenue for the government. This is the deadweight loss, geometrically represented as the Harburger triangle, named after Arnold Harburger. It is the welfare surplus that simply evaporates from the economy.
And for the exam, it is vital to specify that the true measurement of this excess burden must be derived using the Hicksian compensated demand curve, not the ordinary Marshallian demand curve.
Wait, why is that so important?
Because paying a tax makes a consumer poor. That's the income effect. But the income effect is merely a transfer of purchasing power from the citizen to the state. Assuming the state spends that revenue efficiently, the income effect itself doesn't destroy aggregate societal welfare.
Oh.
The pure inefficiency, the deadweight loss, is caused exclusively by the substitution effect. It's the welfare destroyed when the change in relative prices induces individuals to alter their behavior to buy less of the taxed good and substitute toward less efficient untaxed alternatives. The Hicksian compensated demand curve holds utility constant, isolating this pure substitution effect, which is why it forms the hypotenuse of the true Harburger triangle.
Okay, now let's translate the algebraic derivation of that triangle because the examiners explicitly asked for it in 2025.
Yes.
Using a Taylor series approximation, the formula for the excess burden or deadweight loss resolves to 1/2 times the tax rate squared times elasticity times price times quantity.
Let's dissect the components. The 1/2 is just the geometric constant for the area of a triangle. P times Q represents the total revenue or size of the market being taxed.
Okay.
Elasticity represents the compensated price elasticity of demand. Higher elasticity means a more violent behavioral shift, widening the base of the triangle and increasing the deadweight loss.
But the most critical variable in that entire equation, the mechanism you must highlight in bold ink on your exam paper, is t squared. The tax rate is squared. The relationship between the statutory tax rate and the resulting economic destruction is not linear. It is strictly convex.
The implications of convexity are profound for tax policy.
Yeah.
If a finance minister doubles the tax rate from 5% to 10%, they do not double the deadweight loss, they quadruple it.
Wow.
If they triple the rate, the excess burden expands by a factor of 9.
So this mathematical reality dictates the fundamental axiom of efficient tax design: broad bases and low rates. It is infinitely more efficient to levy a tiny 1% tax across a massive basket of goods than to levy a 20% tax on a very narrow sliver of the economy. That squared term will exponentially punish any attempt to concentrate tax rates.
Absolutely. But, the government must raise a specific, exogenously determined amount of revenue to fund those public goods we discussed earlier.
Right.
So if every tax generates an excess burden, how do we structure the rates across different commodities to ensure the aggregate deadweight loss to the entire economy is minimized?
Okay, this is the realm of optimal tax theory, and it brings us to Frank Ramsey's monumental 1927 contribution. Ramsey set up a Lagrangian optimization problem. Maximize the utility of a representative consumer, subject to the constraint that the government must raise a fixed amount of revenue, right?
And solving that optimization yields the Ramsey rule, widely known as the inverse elasticity rule. In spoken English, to raise a given amount of tax revenue with the least possible efficiency loss, the tax structure should be designed so that the percentage reduction in the quantity demanded is identical across all taxed goods.
Okay, so to achieve that proportional reduction, the specific tax rate applied to each good must be inversely proportional to its price elasticity of demand.
Yes.
High elasticity equals low tax. Low elasticity equals high tax.
Let's walk through the logic. If a good is highly elastic, even a small tax will cause a massive behavioral distortion, right?
Right.
It widens the Harburger triangle and destroys the revenue base.
Right.
Therefore, you must tax it very lightly. But if a good is highly inelastic, consumers will continue to purchase it almost regardless of the price.
Yeah.
You can levy a massive tax rate, extract huge revenues, and the quantity traded will barely decline, keeping the deadweight loss triangle very narrow.
Okay, so the mathematically flawless optimal tax system demands that we place the heaviest tax burdens on goods with the most inelastic demand curves. What goods are highly inelastic?
Well, life-saving pharmaceuticals, basic staple foods like rice and wheat, water.
The foundational necessities of human survival.
Yes. And what goods are highly elastic? Luxury vacations, designer clothing, high-end entertainment. Thus, the Ramsey inverse elasticity rule dictates that the state should aggressively tax the food of the poorest citizens while minimizing the tax on the luxuries of the wealthy.
Wait, taxing basic necessities heavier than luxury yachts? That sounds horribly regressive.
It is. This is the dark, brutal paradox we established at the beginning. The Ramsey rule achieves absolute, perfect economic efficiency. It rigorously minimizes total deadweight loss. But its distributive consequences are horrifically regressive. It creates a violent, irreconcilable conflict between efficiency and equity. And this tension is exactly what the examiners want you to evaluate. Optimal tax theory doesn't provide a utopian solution. It provides a rigorous quantification of the trade-offs. You must sacrifice equity to gain efficiency, and you must accept deadweight loss if you wish to implement progressive, equitable taxation.
Precisely. Now, before we move to the taxation of income, there is a crucial corollary to commodity taxation you must be prepared for. The Diamond-Mirrlees production efficiency theorem, published in 1971.
Okay.
While Ramsey focused on taxing final consumption, Diamond and Mirrlees asked whether the government should tax intermediate goods used in the production process, things like raw steel, wholesale flour, or industrial microchips.
And their theorem proved mathematically that an optimal tax system must never distort the production side of the economy. Production efficiency must be strictly maintained, meaning the economy should always operate on the outer boundary of its production possibility frontier.
Right. Because if the government taxes intermediate goods, it creates cascading inefficiencies. A tax on steel makes tractors more expensive, which makes wheat more expensive, which makes bread more expensive.
Wow.
The compounding distortions shift the entire economy inward, off the Pareto frontier, shrinking the total economic pie before final consumption even occurs.
Which provides the foundational theoretical justification for the modern value-added tax, or VAT, system used globally. Under a true VAT, businesses receive input tax credits for the taxes paid on intermediate goods. The tax is systematically stripped out of the production chain, ensuring that the final effective burden falls exclusively on the point of final consumption, preserving Diamond-Mirrlees' production efficiency.
Exactly. So we've optimized commodity taxation, but what about taxing labor? We've established that society generally rejects the extreme regressivity of the Ramsey rule. Society demands vertical equity, which requires a progressive income tax.
Right.
And this leads us to the monumental work of Sir James Mirrlees on the optimal income tax model, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize.
Because Mirrlees confronted the equity efficiency trade-off directly. The government desires to maximize a social welfare function, perhaps a Ralston framework prioritizing the poorest, or just a standard utilitarian sum of all utilities. To achieve this, it wants to redistribute wealth from the high earners to the low earners.
Yes, in a world of perfect information, the government would simply observe every individual's innate ability or wage-earning potential and levy a lump sum tax on the high-ability individuals.
Right, because a lump sum tax has zero marginal rate, so it creates no substitution effect and therefore zero deadweight loss.
Exactly. But Mirrlees introduced the critical constraint of asymmetric information. The government cannot observe an individual's innate ability. It can only observe their final realized income. This introduces the incentive compatibility constraint.
Okay, so if the tax schedule is aggressively progressive, say, a 90% marginal tax rate on top earners to fund massive redistribution, the high-ability individuals face a devastating marginal effective tax rate. And the marginal effective tax rate calculates the true percentage of the next dollar earned that is lost to taxes and phased-out benefits.
Yes, so faced with a 90% marginal rate, the high-ability surgeon or entrepreneur simply alters their behavior. The substitution effect dominates.
Right.
They work fewer hours, take longer vacations, or choose early retirement. They strategically mimic the income level of lower-ability individuals to avoid the punitive tax bracket.
So the labor supply of the most productive citizens contracts violently. The aggregate economic output shrinks. And paradoxically, because the tax base collapses, the government collects less total revenue, leaving fewer resources available to redistribute to the poorest citizens.
Exactly. It's the theoretical underpinning of the Laffer curve dynamics. Mirrlees mathematically demonstrated that there is a strict binding limit to how progressive an income tax can be before the behavioral distortions destroy the welfare objectives.
Right.
The optimal income tax schedule must balance the societal desire for equity against the absolute necessity of maintaining the incentive to produce. In many of Mirrlees' simulations, the optimal marginal tax rate actually flattens out or even declines at the very highest income deciles, purely to prevent the highest productivity individuals from withdrawing their labor from the market.
I mean, it is a profound realization. We construct these massive, coercive fiscal architectures, attempting to bend the economy toward fairness, only to discover that the mathematical constraints of human behavior force us into deeply uncomfortable compromises.
Yeah, which is exactly the level of synthesis you need to demonstrate on your exam. We have mapped the entire diagnostic landscape today. We traced the failure of the market through the non-excludability and non-rivalry of pure public goods. We derive the Samuelson condition and watch voluntary Lindahl pricing collapse under the preference revelation problem.
And then we established the Smith canons, justified progressive taxation through the diminishing marginal utility of income, and stripped away the illusion of statutory incidence to reveal how inelasticity traps the taxpayer.
Yes. We proved that the excess burden scales with the square of the tax rate, and we confronted the brutal regressive reality of the Ramsey inverse elasticity rule and the Mirrlees constraints on optimal income redistribution.
So based on the trajectory of the 2024 and 2025 papers, we can confidently project the critical test areas for the 2026 GE-03 Paper 3. We have 3 primary predictions for high-weightage questions.
Prediction 1. The mechanical derivation of the excess burden. Do not just draw the Harburger triangle. You must initiate the proof using the Hexian compensated demand curve to isolate the substitution effect.
Right. Write out the Taylor series approximation culminating in 1/2 times t squared times elasticity times p times q, and explicitly articulate the policy implication of the squared tax rate that deadweight loss is convex, mandating broad tax bases and low marginal rates.
Perfect. Prediction 2. The Ramsey inverse elasticity rule. You will likely be asked to establish the Lagrangian optimization framework. But the critical evaluation points will be on the equity implications.
You must demonstrate that you understand the rule's regressive nature, that achieving mathematical efficiency requires placing the heaviest tax burdens on the inelastic necessities of the working class.
Exactly. And prediction 3, the Samuelson condition. You must contrast the horizontal summation of private goods with the vertical summation of pure public goods. Write the condition as the sum of MRS equals MRT, anchoring it in the necessity of Pareto efficiency.
And crucial for top marks, connect its theoretical elegance to its practical impossibility by detailing the free rider problem and the mechanism design failure inherent in Lindell pricing.
The examiners are looking for scholars who can navigate the mathematics while remaining fully cognizant of the welfare implications. You have the theoretical framework. The task now is to practice the algebraic derivations until they are second nature.
Definitely. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you continue your revision. It is a tension that defines the entire field of public finance. We build elegant Lagrangian multipliers and complex utility functions to find the optimal tax. But given that mathematical efficiency requires taxing the poorest hardest, and taxing intermediate goods destroys production efficiency, is it possible that a perfect tax system is theoretically impossible?
It really suggests that public finance is less about finding a pristine mathematical solution and more about engaging in the rigorous, quantifiable management of economic damage.
It is the dark art of choosing the most politically acceptable distortion. The X-ray of the economy is always murky, but you now have the tools to read the scan, keep grinding through the derivations, keep interrogating the assumptions behind the math, and we will see you on the next deep dive.